Most people think they understand what just happened. They saw the headline, nodded their head, and scrolled past it like it was just another feel-good sports story. Caitlin Clark signs a deal with NBC. Cool. Another athlete gets a TV gig. End of story. Except that's not what this was. Not even close. Because this wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a guest appearance. And it definitely wasn't NBC doing Caitlin Clark a favor. This was a transfer of power, and it happened so quietly that most of the basketball world didn't realize the ground shifted under their feet until it was already too late. What NBC Universal just did wasn't about commentary. It wasn't about insight. It wasn't even about ratings in the traditional sense. This was about control. Control over the narrative. Control over the future. Control over who gets to define what basketball looks like in the next decade. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. This deal didn't just elevate Caitlin Clark. It exposed how fragile the WNBA's position really is. While league executives are trying to keep a tight grip on players, while negotiations are quietly stalling behind closed doors, while tension keeps building with no clean resolution in sight, one player just stepped completely outside the system and proved something terrifying. She doesn't need permission anymore. She doesn't need to wait her turn. She doesn't need to rely on the league's schedule, its stability, or its approval. She doesn't even need the season to exist. And that's the nightmare scenario nobody in power was prepared for. Because once a player reaches a point where the league needs them more than they need the league, the entire balance collapses. That's not speculation. That's history. That's economics. That's exactly how power shifts happen in sports. And the scariest part? This wasn't reckless. This wasn't accidental. This was calculated. NBC didn't stumble into Caitlin Clark. They chose her. They didn't promote her as a WNBA star. They promoted her as something much bigger. Something far more dangerous to the old hierarchy. They promoted her as the face of basketball. Period. And once you understand that, everything else starts to make sense. The timing, the platform, the confidence, and why certain people are suddenly very uncomfortable. Because to understand why this deal matters so much, you first have to understand why it shouldn't exist at all. And that's where this story really begins. There's an unspoken rule in sports media that nobody ever writes down, but everyone follows. You earn your seat slowly. You prove yourself over time. You show loyalty to the system, and eventually maybe you get rewarded with visibility. Caitlin Clark skipped every single step. This wasn't a retired legend easing into a studio role. This wasn't a former champion slowly transitioning into analysis after a decade of dominance. This wasn't even a long-tenured veteran being eased into media as a nice opportunity. This was a 24-year-old active player being handed a multi-year role on one of the biggest basketball platforms in the world and being treated like she already belongs there. That alone should make people pause. Because networks don't give out multi-year deals unless they're certain of one thing: long-term value. Not potential. Not hype. Value. The kind that moves numbers, shapes conversation, and justifies risk at the highest level. NBC didn't test Caitlin Clark. They committed to her. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Guest appearances are disposable. Multi-year partnerships are infrastructure. When a network locks you in like this, they're not planning a segment. They're planning a future. They're planning storylines. They're planning branding. They're planning moments built around you. And here's the detail that quietly changes everything. NBC is not marketing Caitlin Clark as a women's basketball voice. They are marketing her as a basketball voice. Full stop. That might sound subtle, but it's actually explosive. Because the moment you remove the qualifier, the conversation changes. She's no longer boxed into a lane. She's no longer being measured against expectations that were designed to keep things separate. She's being placed in the same ecosystem as the most recognizable figures in the sport. And networks do not make that move unless they are absolutely confident in one thing. She can carry attention on her own. Think about how rare that is. Think about how many elite players never cross that line. Think about how many stars sell jerseys, but can't hold an audience when the ball isn't in their hands. NBC looked at the data, the reactions, the viral moments, the engagement curves, and they came to a conclusion that a lot of people still aren't ready to accept. Caitlin Clark isn't just popular. She's magnetic, and that magnetism works even when she's not playing. That's the part that makes this unprecedented. Networks usually wait to see if the on-court dominance sustains. They wait to see if the story cools off. They wait for the inevitable regression. NBC didn't wait. They moved early, aggressively, and publicly, planting a flag before anyone else could. And by doing that, they sent a message not just to fans, but to every league executive watching closely. This player operates on a different timeline. While others are still debating whether she's too young, too new, or too overexposed, a major network already decided she's essential. And when a player becomes essential to media partners, everything downstream changes. Contracts change. Negotiations change. Leverage shifts. Suddenly, the traditional power centers don't feel quite as solid as they used to. But even that wasn't the loudest message NBC sent. The loudest message was where they put her. Because the location of her debut said more than any press release ever could. And once you see that stage, you realize this wasn't an introduction. It was an announcement. And what that stage represents is where this story really starts to accelerate. If you want to understand how serious NBC was about Caitlin Clark, stop listening to what they said and start looking at where they placed her. Because networks reveal their true intentions through positioning, not press releases. Madison Square Garden isn't just an arena. It's a declaration. It's the most mythologized building in basketball history, the place where moments are supposed to feel bigger than life, where careers are validated simply by existing inside its walls. Legends aren't made there because they're introduced. They're made there because they're trusted. And that's exactly why this mattered. NBC didn't debut Caitlin Clark on a quiet weeknight broadcast. They didn't hide her behind a secondary matchup or ease her in on a low-stakes game. They didn't treat her like a novelty or a side story. They dropped her straight into the center of the sport. Prime time. Lakers versus Knicks. Madison Square Garden. That combination is basketball's loudest megaphone. This wasn't about convenience. This was intentional placement designed to send a message to anyone paying attention. This person belongs here. Because if there's one thing networks are terrified of, it's misplacing credibility. You don't put someone on that stage unless you're confident they won't shrink under the lights. You don't pair someone with the most recognizable franchises in the sport unless you're willing to stand behind them when the reaction comes in. And NBC wasn't just willing. They were eager. Think about the psychology of that decision. You have LeBron James on the floor. You have the Knicks, one of the most scrutinized teams in basketball, playing in their home building. You have a national audience that doesn't need an introduction to any of it. And NBC decided the person who could anchor the conversation around that moment wasn't just a former MVP or a retired champion. It was Caitlin Clark. That's not hype. That's hierarchy. Because placement creates perception, and perception creates reality in sports media. The moment you put someone in that seat, the audience subconsciously accepts that they've earned it, whether they want to or not. And this is where the real genius of the move shows itself. NBC didn't ask viewers to take Caitlin Clark seriously. They forced the environment to do it for them. You're watching the Lakers. You're watching the Knicks. You're watching the Garden. And suddenly, there she is, speaking with authority, not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as part of the broadcast spine. That's how legitimacy is manufactured at the highest level. But here's the detail that made this even more disruptive. She wasn't sitting next to mid-level analysts or transitional personalities. She wasn't paired with people who would soften the comparison or lower the stakes. She was seated alongside Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, players whose names don't need explanation, players whose resumes are carved into the history of the sport, players who represent an era of dominance that fans instinctively respect. And Caitlin Clark wasn't placed beneath them. She was placed with them. That's the part critics don't like to acknowledge. This wasn't symbolic inclusion. This was peer placement, equal framing, same camera angles, same conversational weight. NBC didn't build a buffer around her. They didn't protect her from comparison. They leaned into it. Because comparison is power when you believe someone can survive it. And NBC clearly believes that. This setup does something psychologically powerful to the audience. When viewers see her sitting comfortably next to those names, talking hoops without hesitation, breaking down plays without apology, it rewires expectations instantly. She stops being a WNBA star doing TV. She becomes a basketball mind. And once that shift happens, there's no reversing it. This is why the Garden mattered so much. Because Madison Square Garden isn't neutral ground. It amplifies legitimacy and exposes weakness at the same time. If you don't belong, it shows immediately. If you do, the building turns into a crown. NBC didn't gamble here. They placed a confident bet. And the implications ripple outward in ways most people haven't processed yet. Because when a player gains legitimacy on that stage, it changes how other networks view them. It changes how advertisers value them. It changes how leagues negotiate with them. It changes how fans argue about them. Suddenly, debates shift from "should she be here?" to "how big can this get?" And that's when control starts slipping from the old power centers. The WNBA didn't choose that stage. NBC did. And once a media giant takes ownership of your narrative at that level, the league becomes a piece of the story instead of the author. That's the uncomfortable truth buried inside this decision. Because Madison Square Garden didn't just host Caitlin Clark's debut. It validated her authority in front of the entire basketball world. And once that authority is granted, the next step becomes inevitable. Because credibility like that doesn't just elevate perception. It changes the rules. And the next thing it changed was something no trophy, no stat line, and no award ceremony could ever touch. And that's where this story starts to get truly dangerous for the people who thought they still had control. There's a hard truth about professional sports that fans rarely like to admit. Trophies matter, records matter, championships matter, but authority matters more. And authority doesn't come from hardware. It comes from who trusts you to speak when the entire world is watching. That's what Caitlin Clark just received. Because there is a massive difference between being celebrated by your league and being validated by the broader basketball ecosystem. One keeps you relevant. The other makes you unavoidable. WNBA awards live inside the league. Media legitimacy lives everywhere. And NBC just handed Caitlin Clark the kind of validation that can't be voted on, can't be taken away, and can't be ignored. Think about what she's actually being trusted to do. She's not breaking down her own highlights. She's not offering generic praise. She's not delivering scripted talking points designed to protect an image. She's analyzing LeBron James. She's dissecting NBA defenses. She's speaking to an audience that includes players, coaches, executives, and fans who are notoriously unforgiving. That's not ceremonial. That's professional risk. Networks don't put someone in that position unless they are convinced that person understands the game at a level that survives scrutiny. Because the second someone sounds lost, the internet pounces. Clips circulate. Credibility evaporates. NBC knows this better than anyone, and yet they didn't hesitate. This is why this moment outweighs any MVP conversation, any scoring title, any all-star selection. Because awards reward performance. Media trust confirms intellectual authority. And intellectual authority lasts longer than athletic peaks. Once a player is accepted as someone who understands the game deeply enough to explain it, criticize it, and contextualize it, they graduate into a different class entirely. They stop being measured only by what they do on the floor. They become a voice. That's the invisible ceiling Caitlin Clark just shattered. For decades, women's basketball has existed in a parallel conversation, respected by those who follow it closely, but rarely allowed to shape the broader narrative of the sport. Analysis stayed siloed. Recognition stayed compartmentalized. This deal bulldozes that wall. Because Caitlin Clark isn't being brought on to talk about the WNBA as a side note. She's being brought on to talk about basketball as a whole. To weigh in on the same plays, the same stars, the same moments that define the sport globally. That repositions her in the public consciousness immediately. She's no longer just competing for attention inside her league. She's operating on the same narrative plane as NBA legends and national broadcasters. And once that happens, the comparison game changes completely. Critics can argue about stats. They can argue about wins. They can argue about experience. But they can't argue with placement. Because legitimacy is contextual. And NBC placed her in the most unforgiving context imaginable and said, she belongs. That's why this moment is irreversible. You can take away a season. You can delay a schedule. You can argue about contracts. But you can't unring the bell of credibility. Once fans see Caitlin Clark confidently breaking down elite NBA talent, once they hear her speak the language of the game fluently, once they watch legends nod along instead of talking over her, the perception locks in. She's not visiting. She's participating. And that distinction is everything. This also changes how players see her. Because athletes recognize game before fans do. They know when someone understands spacing, timing, decision-making. They know when analysis is real versus rehearsed. And that respect travels fast. The moment players start listening instead of dismissing, the hierarchy shifts. The moment legends engage instead of patronizing, the door closes behind you. That's the quiet power of this move. NBC didn't just elevate Caitlin Clark's profile. They insulated her from the most damaging criticism, the idea that she's just hype. Because hype fades under analysis. Real understanding doesn't. And now she has a platform where that understanding can be displayed weekly, in front of the harshest audience in the sport. This is why this deal changes her leverage forever. Because once a player becomes a trusted interpreter of the game, leagues lose their monopoly on relevance. The conversation no longer begins and ends with the scoreboard. And that reality becomes deeply uncomfortable when the league itself is already under pressure. Because as Caitlin Clark's legitimacy expands outward, the WNBA's control tightens inward. And that tension couldn't be arriving at a worse possible moment. Because behind the scenes, the league is facing a problem it can't market its way out of. And that problem is leverage. While the headlines were celebrating Caitlin Clark's rise, something far less glamorous was unfolding quietly in the background. No flashing graphics. No breaking news banners. Just closed doors, stalled conversations, and an uncomfortable silence that everyone inside the league felt, but nobody wanted to spotlight. The WNBA has a leverage problem. Collective bargaining negotiations aren't moving the way they're supposed to. Tension between players and league leadership has been building slowly, not explosively, which makes it more dangerous. Because when frustration simmers instead of boiling over, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison for any league that depends on momentum. The public doesn't see the day-to-day strain of those conversations, but the players do. They understand what's at stake. They understand how fragile the financial ecosystem still is. They understand that a delayed season, a shortened schedule, or a full stoppage wouldn't just be inconvenient. For many of them, it would be devastating. And that's the context this NBC deal walked straight into. Most WNBA players don't have the luxury of waiting things out. Their income streams are limited. Overseas play becomes a necessity, not a choice. Endorsements are unevenly distributed. Stability is rare. Leagues know this. That's where leverage usually lives. But leverage only works when everyone is bound by the same dependency. Caitlin Clark just stepped outside of that dependency completely. And that's what changes everything. While negotiations drag on, while pressure builds behind closed doors, one player just locked in guaranteed national exposure and income that has nothing to do with tip-off times, arenas, or league approval. Whether the WNBA plays on schedule, delays, or stumbles into chaos, her visibility remains untouched. That's not a coincidence. That's insulation. And insulation is the one thing leagues fear most when trying to negotiate from a position of authority. Because once a star player proves they can thrive without the league's infrastructure, the power dynamic flips. Quietly at first, then all at once. The league still needs Caitlin Clark. She no longer needs the league in the same way. That asymmetry is dangerous. Ratings data already tells a clear story. When Caitlin Clark plays, attention follows. When she doesn't, interest drops. That reality gives her influence, whether she ever asks for it or not. Now add media independence on top of that. Now add the ability to stay culturally relevant even if the league goes dark. That's when leverage collapses. The WNBA can negotiate with players. It can enforce rules. It can set schedules. But it cannot compete with a national broadcast platform that reaches millions weekly and frames a player as essential basketball viewing. And here's the part that makes this particularly uncomfortable for league leadership. This move doesn't look aggressive on the surface. Caitlin Clark didn't threaten anyone. She didn't issue demands. She didn't take shots publicly. She just made herself untouchable. That's the most powerful kind of leverage because it doesn't provoke immediate backlash. It simply exists. And once it exists, everyone else has to adjust around it. Other players notice this. Agents notice this. Future stars are watching very closely. Because the message is clear. If you are valuable enough, you don't have to wait. If you are marketable enough, you don't have to comply quietly. If you can command attention on your own, the system bends around you. That idea terrifies institutions built on collective control. This is why the timing matters so much. If this deal had happened during a period of league stability, it would still be notable. But happening during a moment of negotiation uncertainty turns it into something else entirely. It becomes a reference point. Every future conversation about power, pay, exposure, and control now includes Caitlin Clark's example, whether anyone wants it to or not. And that's why this deal feels bigger than basketball. Because leverage isn't about money alone. It's about options. And Caitlin Clark just expanded her options beyond the boundaries of the league itself. Which leads directly to the most uncomfortable realization of all. This wasn't just protection. It was a message. A message that said she can exist, grow, and dominate in the basketball conversation even if the league struggles to keep up. And once that message is sent, there's no walking it back. Because the next step after leverage is power. And the way Caitlin Clark secured that power didn't involve confrontation. It involved strategy. Power in sports doesn't announce itself loudly anymore. It doesn't come with ultimatums or public confrontations. The most dangerous power moves are quiet, professional, and framed as opportunity. That's exactly what Caitlin Clark just executed. Because when you strip this deal down to its core, it reveals something leagues hate to admit. The ability to operate independently of their calendar is the ultimate form of control. Caitlin Clark didn't secure a backup plan. She secured a parallel platform. No matter what happens with the WNBA season, she remains visible. No matter how negotiations play out, she remains relevant. No matter how the league positions itself publicly, she maintains her presence in the basketball conversation. That's not security. That's dominance. Historically, leagues have held power because they controlled exposure. If you wanted attention, legitimacy, and reach, you had to go through them. Games were the product. Players were the components. This deal flips that logic. Now, Caitlin Clark exists in a space where her voice reaches fans whether she's playing or not. She doesn't need a scoreboard to generate interest. She doesn't need a press release from the league to shape perception. She speaks directly to the audience from one of the most powerful platforms in sports media. That changes how every negotiation feels. Because when someone across the table knows you're insulated from the worst outcomes, their leverage evaporates. Urgency disappears. Pressure loses its edge. Caitlin Clark can afford patience. The league cannot. And that imbalance defines power. What makes this move even more effective is how clean it looks. From the outside, it reads as ambition, growth, opportunity, a young star expanding her resume. But internally, it's something else entirely. It's a declaration of independence. Not from basketball, from dependency. And once a player reaches that level, everything about how they're treated changes. Decisions get softer. Lines get blurred. Enforcement becomes negotiation instead of authority. Because the league still needs her presence to maintain momentum, ratings, and relevance. She has already proven that her presence drives attention at a scale few others can replicate. Now add a national broadcast audience to that equation. Now add NBA-level exposure. Now add weekly reinforcement of her legitimacy. At that point, the league doesn't just risk losing her participation. It risks losing control of the narrative surrounding her. And that's a line no institution wants crossed. This is why the move feels so threatening without ever being aggressive. Caitlin Clark didn't challenge the system head-on. She simply outgrew it. That's what makes it so hard to counter. You can discipline a player. You can fine a player. You can sideline a player. But you cannot sideline someone who still commands attention without stepping on the court. That's the shift. This also sets a precedent that will echo long after this season. Future stars will look at this moment and understand something important. Media power isn't a retirement reward anymore. It's a tool. And tools are meant to be used while leverage still matters. Caitlin Clark didn't wait until the league had settled. She didn't wait until her prime passed. She didn't wait for permission. She moved when her value was undeniable. That's how real power is exercised. And the most unsettling part for league leadership is that this move didn't fracture public opinion. It didn't trigger backlash at the institutional level. It didn't cause chaos. It was applauded, which means the system can't even push back without looking petty or insecure. That's checkmate, because the conversation has already moved on. Fans aren't asking whether she should have done this. They're asking how far it can go. They're imagining bigger stages, bigger roles, bigger influence. And that curiosity feeds momentum. Momentum is something leagues can't regulate once it escapes their ecosystem. Which brings us to the other side of this equation. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just gain independence. She aligned herself with a network that understands how to weaponize momentum better than anyone. And that's where the story expands beyond one player and one deal. To understand why this deal happened now, you have to stop thinking like a fan and start thinking like a network executive. Because NBC didn't bring Caitlin Clark into their ecosystem out of admiration. They did it out of necessity. This is a ratings war. NBC just reclaimed NBA broadcast rights after decades away from the center of basketball culture. That return isn't symbolic. It's competitive. And competition at that level requires a statement move, not a slow rollout. They didn't want to re-enter quietly. They wanted to re-enter loud. And loud doesn't come from logos or graphics. It comes from attention, from conversation, from controversy, from a figure who pulls viewers across demographics that traditional stars can't reach anymore. NBC studied the landscape carefully. They saw something ESPN and others underestimated for too long. Basketball fandom is no longer siloed by league. It's driven by personalities, narratives, and emotional attachment. And right now, no basketball figure commands that attachment like Caitlin Clark. She brings in fans who didn't grow up watching the NBA. She brings in younger audiences who engage digitally first. She brings in viewers who follow her, not the teams, not the matchups, not the league politics. That's gold. NBC didn't just acquire an analyst. They acquired a bridge, a way to pull millions of people into their broadcast ecosystem who might otherwise never tune in consistently. This is where the deal becomes ruthless in its efficiency. Hate watchers count. Curious viewers count. Skeptics count. NBC understands that controversy doesn't divide audiences, it multiplies them. Every argument about whether Caitlin Clark belongs on that set only increases her visibility. Every viral clip, every heated debate, every dismissive comment fuels engagement. And NBC monetizes engagement better than anyone. This isn't about pleasing purists. This is about winning market share. They didn't choose Caitlin Clark because she's safe. They chose her because she's polarizing. Because polarization keeps people watching. Because indifference kills ratings. And this is where the strategy turns brutal. NBC doesn't care if viewers tune in to praise her or criticize her. They care that viewers tune in at all. Once they're there, once the habit forms, once the audience sticks, the battle is already won. That's why this deal isn't short-term. They aren't chasing a moment. They're building a system where Caitlin Clark becomes a recurring gravitational force within their broadcasts. And that creates a feedback loop. More exposure leads to more conversation. More conversation leads to more clips. More clips lead to more online traction. More traction leads to higher ratings. At that point, the argument about whether she deserves it becomes irrelevant. The numbers speak. This is also why competitors should be nervous. NBC didn't just add talent. They added a cultural accelerant. A figure capable of shifting attention away from entrenched stars who no longer move the needle the way they used to. Basketball media is aging. The same voices, the same debates, the same energy cycles have grown stale. Networks know this. They've been searching for someone who feels new without feeling unqualified. Caitlin Clark fits that profile perfectly. She's fresh without being unfamiliar. She's confident without being rehearsed. She's knowledgeable without being inaccessible. That combination is rare. And NBC didn't wait for her to prove it elsewhere. They claimed her early and built around her. Which brings us to the most symbolic layer of this entire move. Because if this strategy feels familiar, it's because NBC has done this before. They've built a basketball identity around one transcendent figure once already. And history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. There's a reason this move feels bigger than a single contract, and it has nothing to do with Caitlin Clark alone. It has everything to do with history. Because NBC has been here before, and they know exactly what they're doing. Long before streaming wars, long before social media fractured attention, long before highlight culture became algorithm-driven, NBC built its basketball identity around one figure who transcended the sport itself. Michael Jordan. NBC wasn't just broadcasting games back then. They were shaping culture. Jordan wasn't simply an athlete playing on their network. He was the network's basketball identity. His presence defined an era, pulled in casual viewers, and turned regular season games into events. That relationship changed how basketball was consumed. Now fast forward to today. The media landscape is more crowded. Attention is more fragmented. Loyalty is thinner. And stars don't automatically command the same gravitational pull they once did. NBC understands this better than anyone. So when they looked at the modern basketball ecosystem, they weren't searching for the best player on paper. They were searching for the figure who could recenter attention in a chaotic media environment. Caitlin Clark checks that box. Not because she mirrors Jordan's career, but because she mirrors his cultural function. She draws eyes from people who don't normally watch. She sparks conversation beyond the box score. She creates emotional investment that outpaces logic. That's what NBC is rebuilding. They aren't recreating the House of Jordan. They're constructing the House of Clark, updated for a world where attention is currency and narrative is everything. And just like before, they're doing it subtly. No official proclamations. No forced comparisons. No overt branding. Just strategic placement, repeated exposure, and growing authority. That's how you elevate someone without creating resistance too early. This blueprint doesn't rely on dominance alone. It relies on omnipresence, being everywhere at the right moments, being associated with the biggest stages, being trusted to speak when it matters. Caitlin Clark is now positioned at the intersection of all of that. NBA broadcasts, primetime stages, legend-level peers, national conversation. Once a network commits to that level of integration, it's not reversible. You don't back out of identity shifts quietly. You either double down or get left behind. NBC has already doubled down. And this is where the symbolism becomes unavoidable. Jordan wasn't just a player NBC benefited from. He was a force that reshaped how the league interacted with media, sponsors, and global audiences. The NBA grew alongside him, but it also had to adjust to his gravity. Caitlin Clark represents that same adjustment moment, just in a different era and through a different mechanism. Her dominance isn't built solely on scoring. It's built on attention, on conversation, on visibility, on being central to the narrative, whether she's involved directly or not. That's modern power. And modern power doesn't ask permission from institutions. It partners with platforms that amplify it. NBC didn't stumble into this parallel. They recognized it. They saw the opportunity to align themselves early with a figure whose influence was expanding faster than traditional structures could manage. And they moved before that influence became impossible to contain. That's how legacy networks survive relevance shifts. But whenever a new figure rises to that level, there's always resistance. Because elevation creates displacement. And not everyone benefits when a new center of gravity emerges. That backlash was inevitable. The resentment was predictable. And NBC anticipated all of it. Because backlash isn't a bug in this system. It's a feature. The moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto that stage, the reaction split clean down the middle. And that split wasn't accidental. It was inevitable. Because whenever someone rises this fast, this visibly, and this far outside the traditional order, it forces people to confront uncomfortable questions. Not just about her, but about the system itself. And systems hate being questioned. Almost immediately, the noise started. Critics dismissed the move as hype. They called it a gimmick. They questioned her experience, her age, her timing. Some framed it as favoritism. Others suggested she was being pushed too aggressively, too soon. And beneath all of that criticism was something deeper and far more revealing. Fear of displacement. Because attention is finite. Airtime is limited. And every minute Caitlin Clark occupies on a national broadcast is a minute someone else doesn't. That's where resentment grows. Some analysts feel skipped. Some former players feel overlooked. Some voices feel replaced. And instead of acknowledging that shift, it gets reframed as outrage. But here's the problem for the critics. Outrage doesn't slow momentum anymore. It accelerates it. NBC understands this perfectly. Every angry post, every dismissive clip, every argument about whether Caitlin Clark deserves that seat does one thing consistently. It keeps her name in circulation. It keeps her face on timelines. It keeps her at the center of the conversation. In the modern media ecosystem, silence is failure. Controversy is fuel. NBC isn't afraid of backlash. They budget for it. They know that hate watching still counts. They know that skeptics tune in just to catch mistakes. They know that curiosity mixed with resentment produces higher engagement than quiet approval ever could. And Caitlin Clark is uniquely suited to survive that environment. She doesn't shrink under scrutiny. She doesn't dodge conversation. She doesn't play defensive. She speaks comfortably, calmly, confidently. That alone disarms a huge portion of criticism. Because the fastest way to expose a gimmick is to let it speak. And the fastest way to kill backlash is competence. Every time she breaks down a play clearly, every time she anticipates a rotation, every time she explains spacing or decision-making without hesitation, the argument weakens. Not loudly, gradually. And that's worse for critics. Because loud failures go viral once. Quiet competence wins over time. This is where the resentment turns inward. At some point, the criticism stops being about Caitlin Clark and starts being about what she represents. A shift in who gets visibility. A shift in whose voice matters. A shift in how basketball culture defines expertise. And that's not something you can argue away with stats. This is also where gender tension creeps into the conversation, whether people admit it or not. A woman occupying space that has historically been guarded creates discomfort, especially when she isn't asking for permission or validation. She isn't framed as inspirational. She isn't framed as symbolic. She's framed as authoritative. That's the real disruption. And NBC didn't just allow that framing, they engineered it. They didn't soften her presence. They didn't surround her with disclaimers. They didn't preemptively defend her. They trusted her to stand on her own. That trust sends a message louder than any rebuttal. And every time backlash spikes, it only reinforces the strategy. Because the people who don't like her will keep watching to find cracks. The people who support her will watch to defend her. And the people who are undecided will tune in to see what the noise is about. That's three audiences moving toward the same broadcast. This is why backlash no longer functions as resistance. It functions as distribution. Caitlin Clark doesn't need universal approval. She needs sustained attention. And attention is exactly what controversy guarantees. Over time, the tone will shift. It always does. Critics will get quieter. Arguments will become more technical. Resentment will give way to reluctant acknowledgement. Not because everyone changes their mind, but because the narrative hardens. And once a narrative hardens, it becomes reality. That's the stage Caitlin Clark is entering now. The phase where her presence stops being debated and starts being assumed. Which brings us to the final and most important question. If she already controls attention, legitimacy, and platform, what happens next? Because the future of this story doesn't stop at television. It expands. This is the point where everything comes together, and the full weight of this moment becomes impossible to ignore. Because Caitlin Clark's NBC deal isn't just about what she's doing right now. It's about what she's positioning herself to control next. And that control starts with narrative. For decades, leagues dictated the story. They decided which moments mattered, which players were elevated, and which conversations were pushed to the front. Media partners amplified those choices, but the league still believed they were steering the ship. That era is ending. Caitlin Clark now sits in a position where she doesn't just participate in the game, she frames it. She helps define what fans focus on, which performances get contextualized, and how moments are remembered. That's power most players never touch. Now factor in what's coming. NBC isn't just an NBA broadcaster. They're also the Olympic broadcaster. That matters more than people realize. Because the Olympics aren't just another tournament. They're a global narrative event. They shape legacies. They introduce athletes to audiences that don't follow leagues at all. By integrating Caitlin Clark into their NBA coverage now, NBC isn't reacting. They're preparing. They're positioning her as a familiar, trusted face long before the biggest stage arrives. By the time international competition takes center stage, she won't need an introduction. She'll already be part of the basketball conversation at every level. That creates a rare overlap. She can be a competitor on the floor and a trusted voice shaping the story around it. She can explain the game while playing it. She can influence how moments are understood in real time. That's not exposure. That's control. And while all of this is happening, the WNBA is left in a complicated position. The league still benefits from Caitlin Clark's presence. Ratings matter. Attention matters. Momentum matters. But the league no longer owns the narrative surrounding her. That control has shifted outward to media partners who operate on a much larger stage. That shift is permanent, even if the league stabilizes, even if negotiations resolve cleanly, even if everything goes perfectly from here. The balance has already changed. Because Caitlin Clark has proven that the modern superstar doesn't need to wait for institutional permission to grow. She doesn't need to stay contained within one ecosystem. She can expand laterally, vertically, and globally at the same time. And once one player does that successfully, others will follow. That's how systems evolve. This moment will be looked back on as more than a contract announcement. It will be remembered as the point where basketball culture officially acknowledged that influence doesn't live in one place anymore. It lives where attention goes. And attention, right now, follows Caitlin Clark. Not because she demanded it, not because she forced it, but because platforms chose her. That choice reshapes everything, from negotiations to coverage to how future stars think about their careers. This wasn't a debut. It wasn't a promotion. And it definitely wasn't random. It was a coronation. The moment where the lines between leagues, genders, and hierarchies blurred into irrelevance, and one player stood at the center of the conversation, not holding a trophy, but holding the microphone. And once you hold the microphone long enough, you don't just tell the story. You become it. If you want to stay ahead of where this story is going, because trust me, this is only the beginning, make sure you're subscribed right now. These power shifts don't happen overnight, and the mainstream always reacts late. We break them down as they're happening. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay locked in, because the next chapter of this story is going to shake the entire basketball world.